Raymond de la Nézière was born in Strasbourg in the east of France in 1865, the son of a senior civil servant. The family moved to the town of Bourges in 1870, and in 1884 Raymond enrolled for study at the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts in Paris. And only 2 years later, at the age of 21, he was already taking commissions from magazines. But the earliest verifiably dated illustration I could find came from 1890, and it was 1893 that he had his first major success. He had spent over a year with the writer Paul Jousset, travelling through various countries to create the book A Tour of the Mediterranean. This has been a time-consuming and far from easy project, but de la Nézière made many drawings of the various locations they found themselves in, and on their return had rendered them as printable artwork in both colour and monochrome for publication. But however arduous the process had been, the book enjoyed considerable popular success and boosted his reputation and presumably his income accordingly. He also found early success in the 1890s with work for various children's comics, much of which was also published in colour from his pen and watercolour originals. And it was around the same time that he started to appear in the pages of the humour magazines Le Sourire and La Vie Parisienne. Quite a few of the images he created were sequential in nature, and his work was reproduced in both colour and black and white, using quite disparate graphic styles. His own considerable enthusiasm for all things equestrian revealed itself frequently in his humorous magazine work, and in 1897 he published the book Galloping Through the Ages, a not overly serious reflection on man's enduring relationship with horses and riding. But otherwise it was predominantly the humour magazines which constituted his primary outlet, and he continued to vary both his graphic technique and his subject matter from more horsey material through to social and, on occasion, more risque sexual content. In 1902 he was also commissioned to produce a complete edition of the magazine L'Assiette au Beurre, with a collection of bold linear and somewhat subdued colour illustrations on the theme of hunting. And in the same year he produced a series of simple but less overtly cartoonish colour figure studies for the script of the play The Secret of Polichinelle. And by the early years of the new century his popularity was such that he could sell his watercolour originals and prints to eager private collectors and increase his income accordingly. It was also by this point that he had consolidated his position as one of the leading children's strip cartoon creators, with regular and frequent appearances in the comic Le Jeudi de la Jeunesse. The hilarious history of the pig family was one of many series reproduced with bold line work and flat colour, which clearly demonstrated both his conspicuous talent for the creation of highly amusing anthropomorphic animal characters and his pronounced affinity for sequential narrative comic strip illustration. There were several others along similar lines created during the decade, and French children could not get enough of the animals' amusing and expressively drawn antics. These sequential narratives didn't make use of speech balloons, but as was common across Europe at that time, there were captions under each panel in the sequence, more like a picture book format. But de la Nézière carried on illustrating books too, and the adventure story The Hunt in Abyssinia by Henri Decaux was published in 1907. The drawings were printed as tonal monochrome, and although workmanlike, was somewhat stilted when compared to the execution of his more imaginative work of the period. The horse-themed scenarios he was continuing to create for La Vie Parisienne displayed considerably more suggested animation, and were executed in a conspicuously finer line style. But his colour work for Le Sourire persisted with a bolder and more overtly cartoonish style, which he used to get laughs at the expense of the indigenous populations of the French African colonies, with a disregard typical of the period. And as the second decade of the century rolled around, he created yet more strips for Le Jeudi de la Jeunesse, some of which were more historically themed with human female protagonists. In 1910 he returned to the more serious and sentimental side of his output for the story The Child of the Cliff by Auguste Latouche, for which he produced a collection of more plausibly representational line drawings. And he did precisely the same for Out of the Nest, an adventure tale for older children written by Jules Girardet and published in 1913. But it was the same year's considerably more expensive, lavishly bound and printed Siamese Tale of Po Deng, written by Paul-Louis Rivière, which gave him the chance to demonstrate what he could achieve with line and tonal watercolour washes. This was a volume published initially as a limited edition of only 350, and the exotic oriental nature of the narrative was particularly well captured by de la Nézière, with the images placed within fine oriental decorated borders. The book and de la Nézière's visual contribution were in another league altogether from any of his previously published books. When war with Germany began in 1914, he was already 50 years old and not expected to fight, and he carried on working throughout the conflict. Some of his magazine illustration ignored the war altogether, and so did the strip work he was by now creating for another comic for girls, La Semaine de la Suzette, which featured narratives about young girl protagonists which were entirely devoid of the more knockabout qualities of his earlier animal strips. But the war could not be avoided altogether, and some of his cartoons for La Vie and Le Sourire did make reference to it, however absurdly. And in 1915 the novel Towards Revenge by Jehan Demoge did directly address the ongoing warfare, and de la Nézière's ink drawings, while not gory or even particularly violent, reflected the generally sombre tone of the book. This was not a happy time for him, and not only had his youngest brother died in action not long after war had broken out, but de la Nézière's second daughter also died at the age of just 1 year old in 1916. But he worked through his grief, and in 1917 another book about the tragedies of war, Brave Hearts, written by Marie Girardet, was published, with another collection of pen and ink drawings of a similar style and general emotional nature as Towards Revenge. In the following year he also illustrated The Prediction of Itapar, a South American adventure story written by the oddly named Lix Rotis, which had nothing to do with the ongoing conflict and was more escapist in nature. When the Germans were eventually defeated in 1918, de la Nézière produced quite a few rousing patriotic images celebrating his country's victory in the various magazines he continued to work for. And among them he made some amends for his earlier racial mockery with this considerably more honourable image of the troops from the African French colonies who had helped France to victory. In 1919 he illustrated a series of books for children extolling the bravery of the French troops, but unfortunately all I could find as evidence were these covers. It was also in that year he illustrated a series of comical animal-themed books collected under the title Le Buffon Amusant by Georges Louis Leclerc. I could only find decent resolution images for 2 of these, but they are enough to give a clear indication of the comedic antics of at least some of the anthropomorphized animal subjects, created in a similar style to his comic strips for La Jeudi de la Jeunesse, using a particularly bold calligraphic brush line and application of generally flat colour. And if that wasn't more than enough for any one mortal, there was also the publication of Nos Bons Toutous, which translates at least approximately as Our Good Doggies, a collection of pictures for children illuminating the virtues and characteristics of various four-legged friends. This time around, the animals and the human characters were rendered with anatomical plausibility, with some duotone pages, but quite a few more in full colour from de la Nézière's pen and wash originals. By this point the available evidence suggests that it was with books for children that he was most in demand. He illustrated quite a few themed alphabet books in this period, and in 1920 he produced a collection of colour images of the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, most of which took the form of rather stiffly posed portraits. But more significantly, in 1920 he also published a considerably more entertaining collection of colour illustrations for an edition of the fairy tales of Charles Perrault, originally written in the 17th century. This was another example of de la Nézière at his best, artfully combining line and wash with a range of pleasing narrative images, some contained by circular framing and others flowing more naturally across the pages of vignettes. Sadly, 1920 was another year of personal tragedy, when his wife died from an unrecorded illness. Understandably, there was a hiatus in his usually abundant workflow, but he did create a few images for another children's comic titled Guignol, Cinéma des Enfants, which seems to translate somewhat oddly as the Children's Puppet Theatre. And his work for this client saw a return to his earlier animal-themed strips. But in contrast, the strips he was also creating for the girls' comic Lisette at this time continued to favour young, predominantly female characters that the readers could identify with, and any comedy was far lighter of touch. In 1923 he returned to bookwork and published what is now seen as one of his greatest comical achievements, a copiously illustrated edition of the Fables of La Fontaine. This was originally a 17th century verse rewriting of what had originally been Aesop's fables, and the moral messages contained in each story were comically evoked by de la Nézière with conspicuously broad and frequently slapstick appeal, with a range of animals in human clothes and exhibiting all too human character traits. There were some monochrome spot illustrations dotted throughout the book, but its real defining and most appealing feature was the large volume of brightly coloured and boldly delineated full-colour pages, illustrating key moments from the various tales. De la Nézière kept the narrative essence of each fable intact, but added many more contemporary comedic touches of his own, such as the inclusion of a bicycle in the story of the Hare and the Tortoise, and bathing huts and 1920s-style swimming attire for frogs, among many others. The book was a great popular success, which was reprinted several times, and it's easy to see why. Strangely, in the wake of this success there followed a 5-year period during which the only illustrations I could find were covers and double-page spreads produced for the girls' comic Lisette, and although these appearances were fairly regular, they were not what you would call frequent. But in 1928 he returned to books and depictions of animals for Le Petit Bouffon Illustré. But on this occasion the book featured considerably more straightforward, anatomically correct images of the creatures depicted. Effectively they were what could be considered educational wildlife images for children, and each was posed without undue animation in a suitable background environment suggestive of its natural habitat. It was also in 1928 that he created emotionally charged monochromes for an edition of Prosper Mérimée novel Columba. This hot-blooded melodrama concerned a young Corsican woman determined to avenge her father's death. De la Nézière again rose to the occasion with a collection of suitably rousing images. In 1931 he returned to line and watercolour washes for an account of the life of Joan of Arc, written by George Goyot. The book boasted a large number of particularly evocative illustrations, each of which illuminated a moment of significance in the life of this ultimately tragic but inspirational French historical figure. As is almost invariably the case in so many of the videos I make, nothing is recorded about de la Nézière's sources for historical research, nor did I find any evidence to support the notion that he did or didn't use life models in the creation of this more serious-minded aspect of his illustration output. But it seems unlikely that he simply made it up, as he evidently did with his more comic and anthropomorphic work. He followed this a year later with an alphabet book of the saints. They were rendered similarly to the Joan of Arc book, but their more formal composition and tendency towards similar portraiture to the earlier Napoleon book hampered any realistic chance of them having the same dramatic impact as the Joan of Arc illustrations. Nevertheless, they were a visually appealing collection, and the book was a popular success with many of the more devout French parents of small children. But this rather staid publication was followed in 1933 with the publication of an edition of The 1001 Nights, a considerably more entertaining collection of fantasy stories. This was a major accomplishment with plenty of engaging, gracefully drawn monochromes, and even more impressively, a large volume of full-colour page illustrations detailing moments from the Middle Eastern and Oriental stories of Aladdin, Sinbad and Ali Baba, along with many others from this exotic collection, which had attracted and continues to attract so many other illustrators. As with Joan of Arc, these were obviously the results of considerable research and study. And once more his accomplished pen and watercolour technique was put to particularly good use with a collection of vibrant images. And although suitably romantic in nature, there was yet again considerable plausibility in his evocations of all the characters and a wide range of scenic environments. And in many ways it would have been the perfect project and an impressive end to his career. But despite his advancing years, there was still more to come, even if not of the same truly remarkable standard. Around the same time, he was commissioned to illustrate a series of textbooks for children on a variety of subjects from language to science and history. And his pen drawings, some of which dared to display at least a little humour, were used throughout to liven up the necessarily information-based text. He was also still working for the comic Lisette with more strips of a historical nature, but the last dated issue featuring his work that I could find was in 1936, and it seems most likely that at this point he eventually retired. Unfortunately, in 1940 personal tragedy struck again, when his only adult daughter Solange also died. And Raymond de la Nézière later died 13 years later in the Val de Loire town of Levet, at the age of 87 in 1953. Sadly, he will almost certainly not be the last subject I've covered in the series, who created a vast body of entertaining and visually delightful work during his lifetime, but who also suffered terrible personal losses. But despite his life now being so poorly recorded, he was a significant presence in early 20th century French illustration, and I'm glad to have had the opportunity to bring his work to at least a few more people.